So it's very interesting, I think, to take inspiration from the work that is being done on trafficking at the EU level, and of course very important to ensure that it's properly implemented. Just to say that just to explain a little bit about what I do, I'm sure a lot of you don't know what I do. I am an article in legislation, in EU law. I am Article 20 of the legislation, and I attempt to coordinate the work that we do with different Commission services, with EU institutions, where appropriate with the Member States, international organizations, third countries, and so on. And we try to create policy coherence in the work that we do. We try to coordinate the funding to ensure that we marry the policy with the funds, and of course to ensure the implementation of the law. I think very broadly speaking, if we can say that violence against women is one of the priorities in the gender equality strategy of the Commission, but where we can very concretely see the work being conducted at the EU level on violence against women is on trafficking. Just to remind you that, first of all, to clarify that I will not talk about everything we do on trafficking. We work a lot on trafficking for labor exploitation, increasingly on benefit fraud. We work a lot on investigations, prosecutions. We work on organ trafficking. We do work at various levels. I will not concentrate on this as it might not be your primary interest, but I want to be very clear that this is one element of the work that we do, what I will present today. First of all, when we talk about trafficking, think about organized crime. It is the only form of organized crime that it is explicitly prohibited in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it's just not a lot of blah blah, it's a human rights violation. It is a human rights violation according to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So when we do something, when we work against trafficking human beings, we are implementing EU law. We're implementing the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And we have formally recognized as the European Commission that trafficking in women is a form of violence against women and girls. We went to the Commission on the Status of Women, the 57th session, 2 years ago, and we explicitly said that. There is a lot of commitment at the EU level to work on trafficking at various levels. I will not elaborate on that. But I can tell you a little bit about what we know about trafficking. As you know, from issues of violence against women, from rape, from domestic abuse and so on, it's very hard to come up with data because it is a very sometimes hidden form of organized criminality that affects individuals. But we know we have data from the years 2010 to the years 2012 of the numbers of people that were registered with the authorities. And we know that the numbers are really a lot higher, of course. The numbers are 30,146 people in the EU that were registered with the authorities. So imagine the real scale of the problem. When it comes to sexual exploitation, it's no surprise. 69% of the victims of trafficking are victims of sexual exploitation. And how many of them are women and girls? 95%. So of course trafficking has a clear gender. We identified in the EU 1,000 child victims for sexual exploitation. This is the number of identified victims by the authorities. Imagine the real numbers. And most of the victims that we identified and most of the traffickers are EU citizens. So it's very easy to say that it's something that happens very far away or it affects only non-EU citizens, but this is not the case. When it comes to sham marriage, I want to say a few things first about sham marriages, very specifically because the Latvian government has shown a particular interest in this issue. And also, I think it's extremely valuable, this contribution, because we talk very little bit about it. And instead of talking about what Europol says and what we all do, I was listening to you, so I'll do it differently. I will tell you what I saw. When I go to member states, most of the times I visit shelters, I speak to NGOs and I speak to the authorities, I speak to the ministers and so on. In one of my visits to a member state, I met a young woman who was told by her best friend to go and live in a Western European country because there were lots of job opportunities there. So because it was her best friend and she called her from this country, she said, okay, I'll go and look for a job. So they communicated online. Most of the recruitment happens online, and she goes to this country. The minute she gets there, she's locked into a house, and she's forced to marry a man from a non-EU national. Then supposedly both of them had the benefits, they could profit from the benefit systems, the welfare system of the country, but of course the woman was locked in a room providing sexual services for the clients that he brought in the house, and then he made the money. She didn't step out of the house for 10 months. And then a neighbor suspected something, he saw her from the window and so on, and she was later identified as a victim of trafficking by the police of this capital city. She was assisted, she was supported, she returned to her country, and she was in this shelter. She cannot return to her house because the traffickers are blackmailing her family that if they find her again, they will kill her. So she cannot return to her own city. She has blood cancer and heart disease. And because of a number of complications with the system when she was repatriated, she has no access to healthcare. And she goes to school escorted by the volunteers in the shelter. This is one reality. When we talk about sham marriages and we just talk about it like it's something always about some passport somewhere. But this is the reality of people. If this is not violence against women, I don't know what is. So I'll skip all the 2 pages about what Europol says about it. It says the same thing basically, but in elaborate long words about prosecution and conviction and so on. We're dealing with a crime, a very serious crime. And we have women who are victimized in this situation for various forms of exploitation and subjected to different forms of violence at the same time. So what can we do and what do we do at the EU level? We have legislation. And I'm not here to do the Eurocrat thing and tell you, oh, we're wonderful in the EU. But this is legislation that is actually fantastic. Even the NGOs say that it's a very good legislation. All stakeholders say that it's a very good legislation. And it's very good because it focuses not only on the criminals, but it focuses on the victims. It has a very strong gender dimension. It focuses on children, on the rights of the best interest of the child. And it focuses on prevention. Not many pieces of EU law focus on prevention. So I think we can take a lot of inspiration from this. Most of the member states have notified the European Commission that they have translated this law into their national law. And now we're looking into this. We're studying it to see if this is what the member states have done. We also have an EU strategy. So we have the policy framework of the Union. We have that guides the work that we do on all these areas, on prevention, protection, prosecution. One of the things that I noticed while we were implementing, and I'm responsible for implementing this EU policy framework, and it sounds very big. What I realized is changing a little bit, but not enough, and today's meeting is an example. We want to get all the stakeholders involved, migration officials, law enforcement authorities, a lot of them doing very good work. Member states, prosecutions, judges, NGOs, people from different ideologies. And we want them to talk to each other because it is only through that we can both understand the problems and have an impact. But in the beginning, most of the conferences I would attend were only one type of people. I go to Europol, I meet with the law enforcement. I come here, it's the NGOs. I go to speak to migration officials, it's only migration officials, etc., etc. It's changing a little bit, but not enough. And I think it is only through this dialogue that we can get a little bit further. We need to listen to each other. If I'm not here to listen to your conclusions, how am I going to take them with me? It's very easy, if we're honest, you could send me a book. Will I read it? No. Because I receive 500 books a year or something. It's not exaggeration. But when we talk to each other, it makes a lot of difference, I think. We have done a lot of work, especially on children, but I will focus on the gender dimension, and when I talk about the gender dimension, I mean women, girls, men, and boys. As I said, it's very clear to us that trafficking in human beings, especially for the phenomenon of sexual exploitation, has a very clear gender. It constitutes structural violence against women, in this case predominantly male violence against women. And when I look at the Eurostat report, when I tell you about these numbers, the 69%, the 95%, what am I talking about? The Eurostat report, this is official statistics from the member states, include exploitation for prostitution or other forms in the areas of street prostitution, massage parlors, escort companies, throughout the sex industry. It is everywhere and it is very profitable. I'll come back to how profitable it is, but just to tell you now that what we know from the law enforcement is that there are very clear links between prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation. I want to be very clear here. I'm not here to offer ideological or political opinions. I'm here to tell you facts. And the facts are that trafficking happens especially in high-risk sectors, like the textile industry. I will come back to what the colleague said about the private sector. Like in agriculture, unfortunately the cannabis trade, and prostitution. Unless we are able to act in this area, we are unable to help people within this sector who are trafficked. So the European Union cannot do anything about prostitution and it doesn't have an opinion, but it can do a lot when it comes to the exploitation of the prostitution of others. As per Article 6, of course, of CEDAW as well, and we can take inspiration from that. And it's very clear in our legislation in Article 2, the definition. So we have full competence there. So we are here to talk about trafficking. What is trafficking? It's when you buy and sell people and their services. It's clear. This is what we're talking about. So we talk a lot about vulnerability, and I heard vulnerability throughout the room. Here I will have to disagree with you. I don't think vulnerability causes trafficking. We have a lot of poverty in the world, we have a lot of gender inequality, we have a lot of violence against women, we have unfortunately too many wars going on at the moment, conflicts and so on. These things make people vulnerable to trafficking and a lot of other things, but they don't cause trafficking. Trafficking happens because only of two reasons. Because of money, financial profits, and because of demand. So, if there is no demand, and if there is no money, what do you get? You get a lot of horrible things in the world, but you don't get trafficking. So let's be clear here. So, I want to talk a little bit about that because it is in our legal framework. We talk a lot about victims. And it is important, and it is the most important parameter of our legislation, and we have a lot of actions to protect, assist and support victims, and all the member states have to do their utmost to do that. We talked a lot about traffickers, about the criminals, and the criminals should be prosecuted and convicted, and this is not being done enough. And what do we not talk about? The users. And we have to talk about the users. And why do we have to talk about the users? Because behind every trafficker and behind every victim, there is a user. This is for all forms of exploitation. I want to be clear. So if I go and buy this jacket for 25 cents from the street and there's somebody looking and so on, there's something wrong there. There is something wrong. There is somebody, it means that I am personally responsible for buying or selling or doing whatever it is that I do with a product or a person. I want to highlight this issue of money because the NGOs live in one planet, the law enforcement in another planet, and prosecutors in another. We have to all live in the same planet. We have to follow this money. Who makes money? Legal sectors in legal businesses. Legal sectors in illegal businesses. Illegal sectors in illegal businesses. So, when you apply for a job online and you're 16 or 25, you apply sometimes through legal agencies and sometimes illegal agencies. When somebody enters a hotel with a potential victim, questions need to be asked. If they're not asked, it's just profit making. There's a lot of things we need to consider. So if there's one thing that the NGOs can do is hold companies, services, industries, and governments accountable. Governments not because they make money, but they can ask those who make the money. And why do I say that? Article 5 in the legislation is very clear. Legal entities are liable. So industries, businesses, companies, whatever you want to call them, legal entities are legally accountable from now on under this EU legislation if they are in any way involved in human trafficking. Article 5. So here's my question to all of you. In your member states, when was the last time that any company, employer, blah, 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 was taken to court for the conviction of human trafficking? This is questions that NGOs can ask, and this is questions that the Commission will ask because we are monitoring EU law. Let me tell you something else about the law. I keep talking about demand, not because I have some position in my head about demand, but because the directive is very clear. The member states, the EU member states, are legally obliged to take action to reduce demand. I don't understand demand as posters on the wall. Very welcome, but I don't know what the result is and the impact. How do member states take action to reduce demand? The member states are also asked to consider criminalizing those who knowingly, I stress knowingly, don't use it wrongly, those who knowingly make use of the services of victims of trafficking. Why is that important? First of all, in most of our member states, maybe not most, maybe half or a bit more than half, those who knowingly use the services of victims are not criminalized. In my little head, trafficking in human beings is a crime. So we are not criminalizing a crime. So what that means, what does that mean? Impunity for the criminals? Do we know of any other areas where we are involved in the crime, in any crime, and we're not criminalized? Sometimes people say, oh, it's difficult to find evidence. I remember these discussions with domestic violence and rape from 40 years ago, 50 years. I'm not 50 yet, but you know, I remember the discussions. So when you think about all that, do we know of any other area where we have a person knowingly involved in a crime and they're not criminalized? And why do I ask? Because the Commission has to draft a report according to EU law, according to Article 23, where we assess these measures. So I always go to the member states and ask, because my job is not to talk about it, but my job is to assess what these measures have meant. And what is the job of the NGOs? To ask, have you considered criminalizing? And when you consider criminalizing those who knowingly make use of the services of victims of trafficking, what was the result? Do we have convictions? Do we have prosecutions? What was the impact? Because maybe there's no impact. But we need to know these things. I think it's important. And we also need to know what works in prevention, because the Commission has been funding projects for the last 10 years, heavily funding projects on awareness raising. I am not aware, unfortunately, of human trafficking decreasing. What we can do with prevention, we're looking at a study to see now what works in prevention. We need to continue creating awareness. We need to understand more. We need to make sure that the citizens are fully aware of what trafficking is. But we also need to do it in a way that has an impact. And I don't know if it has had an impact yet. Though this is what this study is going to show us now, and we will publish the results. Now, last week I was with a very high-ranking official in another member state from the education ministry. And this person was telling me, we're doing all this, and da, 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 da. And I said, okay, what are you educating people in schools for? They said they had huge programs on trafficking in every school, and da, 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 da. And I said, what are you doing? Are you telling them not to become traffickers? He said, no. Are you helping them not to become victims? Because in their country there are not many victims. It's more of a destination country, if you like. He said, no. I said, so basically what we're doing, we are educating people not to become users. This is what we need to do, of potential victims of trafficking. I'm always talking about victims of trafficking. Or unless when we are talking about victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, especially children, we are educating them not to become rapists, because it's multiple rape. This is a criminal offense. Huh? I'm talking about trafficking, always. So I urge you to consider how best to have projects that have an impact, that result. I know it's very difficult to measure, but sometimes we know more than others. It's more about telling people, but then what happens when people know? Does it make a difference? We need to reflect a lot more on that. We're going to have a call for proposals in a few months, very few months. It's going to be on the Commission website, and where NGOs are very welcome to apply. I can tell you that 3 years ago, we had, from 3 years ago to today, we have 4 times more NGOs, new NGOs, who have applied for our funds, and 4 times more NGOs who have received funds. So I'm very glad that we have this program, that I'm sure nobody looks at from here, because it is under Home Affairs. Because NGOs go to one kind of information, law enforcement goes to another, and so on. It shouldn't be the case. This is a program, we call it the Internal Security Fund. And this is where trafficking is, really. This is the umbrella on trafficking. I'm sure many of you know of the Daphne program. This is one program. But we are talking about an organized crime. If you work on trafficking, you're reducing organized criminality. So we have had a lot of calls up to now, 2 a year for the last 3 years, to see how best to work with NGOs and the authorities, and I urge you to work with the authorities, because always there's this hostility, but I think that, of course, there's always more that we can do, but I can assure you that I have met a lot of very committed officials and a lot of people from member states who want to do their best. Sometimes they're not able to, sometimes they could do better, we know, but we need to cooperate if this is going to improve. And there's a lot of people who are committed to making a difference, and sometimes they even need our support to have this difference, to make the difference. So I keep talking about cooperating more, and then I will close with this. How can we ensure this cooperation? As we talked with Iluta during the break, we have, and she highlighted it before, we have launched this EU civil society platform for NGOs. We have 120 NGOs, some from non-EU countries. We may be extending this call in the future. From the non-EU countries, we have from Turkey, the Ukraine, Albania, and Moldova at the moment, and the rest are from the EU. And the point is, it's a two-way process, to put it very mildly. Is to learn from the NGOs so we can do our job better, but it's also to inform the NGOs of what they can do and what we do at the EU level, so they can go and also work in a better way with the authorities. We are also going to launch a European Business Coalition. I'm glad you talked about corporate social responsibility. I think it's a little bit too soft, this corporate social responsibility, but it could be a good start. But this European Business Coalition will be formed precisely to see how we can hold the business sector accountable, but also help businesses. Our job is to help legal economy, and not to help the paralegal economy and the criminality. So the idea is to find ways to work in order to boost the legal economy, and the NGOs have to work with the private sector in these efforts. This can be linked also to what Kirsty was talking about before, and so on. Linking up with the private sector can be fundamental. So what can you, and we also have partnerships, so with the civil society, with the business sector, and with third countries. I cannot go on because of time now, but I cannot go on a lot about the third countries, but I can tell you that part of my responsibilities is to ensure that we work with priority countries, so where we see a lot of victims originating from especially. So we work with the EU delegations in these countries. We ensure funding to NGOs in these countries. We try to coordinate the work that is being done with these countries, and also we do it through strategic papers. So we create conditions in the working relationships with these countries, in human rights dialogues, in visa liberalization, in a lot of things. I urge you to look at the website, our colleagues who are not from the EU, to see what we do, and please contact us, and we can also get you in touch with the EU offices in these countries if you want to work further on trafficking. So basically, I've come here to tell you that, you know, when it comes to the issue of trafficking, and here we can talk more about trafficking for sexual exploitation, especially trafficking as a form of structural violence against women and girls, we have done a lot. The EU has produced a lot of, if you like, inspirational legislation that you can also use to see how it can be translated in other forms of legislation. We have very good policy, and we have funding. and we have fully used all these instruments that we have. But what is it that we don't have? If everything is in place, if everything is working so well on paper, and if everything, you've been doing all this work, the member states have been working a lot to transpose this legislation. What I think is really missing is implementation. And this is where both the member states, but the NGOs come in. So how do we ensure that what is on paper is translated into realities that will help people? So we can talk, yes, we need to prosecute the criminals, of course, who says no? How many? Where are they? We need to identify victims. Yes, where are they? I go to NGO meetings and they tell me about 600 people they identified, and then on paper in Eurostat I have 3. It's an example from a member state. I'm not saying that all 600 NGOs identified is the real number, but there's something must be somewhere. So we need to talk about these things. I urge you to work with the authorities, with the member states. Don't work alone. They can be, if the work is constructive, they can be the best allies if it's done in a good way. I think the NGOs are there to speak for those who don't speak. So victims of trafficking are very, very, very hidden. They're in some room after a sham marriage, providing sexual services and unable to step out. I met them. Who's going to speak for them? Your job is to speak for these people. And you cannot do it, like I tell the member states, in isolation. You need to work with different countries. It's very good to see the cooperation here. You need to be loud and consistent. And you need to hold all of us accountable. And I'm in the European Commission as well. You need to ask us what we do. You need to tell us, why did you write this? Why did you do this? And we need to do the same, because NGOs are not, above and beyond everybody. Yeah? It's the same. So I think we need to have more accountability and be persistent, follow up, to ensure that we properly implement legislation. So I hope it helps. I know it's only one of many forms of violence, but I think it's a very severe form of violence. And I think because it's so clearly stipulated in EU law, it's an area where we can actually make a lot of difference if we make the effort. So thank you very much again for inviting me.